Right, we're just going to see how this goes. So, hello. I'm here today. My name is Miss C, and I thought I would have a go at doing something that I've been thinking about doing for a while. And that is something that could be a complete terrible idea or could be a really good idea. I'm kind of needing to know what people think once they've watched this. So I've noticed that a lot of YouTube videos at the moment centre around people doing their makeup. And something that I love watching is people doing their makeup whilst talking about true crime sort of cases, stories, and whatever else. So, what I was thinking is I might have a go at doing a makeup and literature kind of thing. As I'm an English teacher, I've been teaching for about 14 years. I'm actually one of these strange people that love literature. I love Shakespeare. I actually love talking about it. And I thought, um, I know that YouTube has a lot of amazing Mr. Bruff type people that tell you, GCSE students especially, how to get good exam results, how to, write good essays, plan good essays, do good revision. And I think they're brilliant. And I would, I think nowadays it's a really nice, easy way to revise. You're not having to sit there and write endless essays. You can actually say you're revising, even though you're sat on YouTube. Brilliant. But I think a little step sort of before that is the importance of actually making sure that you're aware of the stories. You're aware of actually what these texts you're doing exams on are about, because ultimately they're all stories, aren't they? Okay, they might not be stories you particularly want to know about. They might not be stories you really want to read, but they're all stories and they're all important, because if you don't know them really, really well, you can't write about them. You can't write about them properly. So, what I would like to have a go at doing is essentially starting off by just telling you the stories of these texts that you're going to have to look at. We're going to start with Macbeth, makeup and Macbeth. Okay, we're going to start with that, see if it's not a complete disaster. And we're going to go from there. The way I see it is, if you can talk confidently, as confidently as you would talk about your favourite TV programme, your favourite film, okay, and you need to know them, and you need to know the GCSE text like that. You need to be able to talk about them, the characters, the plots, the themes, what happens in what bit. Oh, do you remember when that bit happens, and when Macbeth says this, and when Banquo does this bit? You need to be able to do that with Macbeth like you would with your favourite film, your favourite TV programme, whatever else. Okay. And when you are confidently jumping around the text with that sort of ease, that's when you know that you can go into an exam and any question can't phase you, because it's like, well, I know the story, so I can give you examples about if it's ambition, violence, greed, kingship, because I know the story so well that I'll always be able to come up with examples. So that's my starting point. But because it's potentially going to bore people, shock horror, listening to someone talk about Macbeth, I'm also going to do my makeup at the same time and yeah, see how I can multitask. So let's start. Let's have a think about how we begin. Um, First of all, then, I'm assuming everybody knows that Macbeth was written by Shakespeare, okay, in 1606. And the first thing we need to remember, okay, and I'm not going to be going through this in this particular video, talking about it with regards to exam technique and how to write about it. I just want you feeling good and confident with the text as a text. The thing to remember about that is that this text is a play, okay, and therefore it is going to be different to a book, a novel. Is going to be different to the way it's written in with regards to its form. So when we think about a play, we are thinking about things like, stage directions and entrances and exits, and the way lines are sort of organised differently to if you were just reading it in a novel. You'd be looking at a different set of things to analyse. So let's bear that in mind. Shakespeare wrote this as a play. It's not really written to be just read. It's written to be performed. It's written to be watched and enjoyed. And sadly, we don't get to do that in our lessons all the time. Sometimes we've just got to read it. So let's just bear it in mind, and also bear in mind the time that this play was being written, okay, and being performed when it was first released. So you're looking at the 1600s. Now, the 1600s was a time of England being pretty different to how it is now. And we have to bear that in mind because, however, an audience now would react to certain things in the play may not be how an audience then would react to certain things in the play. Okay. So, for example, we've got the play beginning with witches, haven't we? We've got three witches on the heath. All right. Now, we'll talk about that in a minute. But the key to remember when we talk about that, is that Shakespeare didn't just go, oh, I'm going to include some witches for fun. Number one, you're looking at a time in history when witches were still kind of believed in, were feared. It was dying out, okay? By this point in England, before King James came to the throne, it was actually starting to die out, this kind of, paranoia and fear and witch hunt type stuff. People weren't as, definite that these things existed anymore. But there was still some superstition. There was still some fear of the supernatural, the paranormal, all of that stuff. So therefore, Shakespeare made a conscious choice to begin this play with scary characters. The other thing to remember is that Shakespeare needed to keep the king happy. Nowadays, if you upset the king, I mean, if you were to do something to annoy him, he can't put you to death. He can't have you executed. Well, he might be able to, but not that we'd know about it. He can't do anything aside from legal, like, okay, you've tried to kill the king, you go to prison. Back then, you're not looking at someone just being sent to prison if they tried to kill the king, if they did something against the king. You're looking at him being horribly tortured, horribly executed publicly. And you're also looking at this belief that you would be going to hell. Because the other thing to remember about the time that this play was being written was that people were much more God-fearing than they are now. Nowadays, there's much more of a mix of beliefs. If you look around the world, look around the country, some people believe in God, some people are Muslim, some people are Christian, whatever. Back then, it was more of the general consensus that you believed in God and you believed in a Protestant form of God, which meant that the king was at the very top of the chain of being. I'm sure you've looked at that when you do context. So I won't go into loads of detail about that stuff. But they believed in a chain of being, a hierarchy, which said that God was at the very top, he created everything, and he had decided on an order, a hierarchy, for every single man, woman, child, animal on it. Everybody fit in somewhere, and the king was right at the top. So therefore, if it's a God-chosen thing, and God has said, I want you here, and you here, and the king here, what right have we got, excuse me, drop something on the floor, what right do we have as mere mortals to question God's choice of where people go? If we start mucking about thinking about killing kings, that means that we're questioning God's choice of who should be king. That means we are not respecting his hierarchy. Therefore, we are not just insulting and killing the king, we are smacking God in the face. And this is the sort of God back then that was not very forgiving. That was not what they believed in. People were brought up believing in heaven and hell, and if you didn't do these things in your normal life every day, you'd go to hell. And people would spend their whole lives desperately trying to avoid dying and going to hell. So we have to bear that in mind again for why Shakespeare was writing this play and the way he was writing it. Okay, we had a superstitious country, we had a God-fearing country, and we had a relatively new king on the throne that people weren't sure about yet. We had a king who really did believe in witches still, and therefore, ironically, even though the fear of witches was dying out, he actually started to bring it back. He released a kind of almost like the Daily Mail of the time, trying to re-establish this fear in witches. And he wanted people to be a little bit scared of witches again. He also was very, very interested in the idea of what a king does and what being a king means. And therefore, you can understand maybe a little bit more why Shakespeare wrote a play all about kingship. Think about all the different types of kings we see in this play. We don't just see Macbeth as a king, we see Duncan, who he obviously kills. Spoilers, do apologise if anyone didn't know that. And we also see the King of England at the time, Edward. We also see Malcolm as the new king at the end. Another spoiler, I do apologise. So bear this in mind, because obviously all of that ties in with not just the story and what you're going to understand about it, but also your question is why? Why did Shakespeare write it the way he did? Why did he include the stuff he included, not include other stuff? What was he wanting to do with all of this? And that's the thing that we have to think about. Okay, so we understand a little bit of the background. Again, I can do more detailed context if that's something that people want. But for now, you're understanding kind of, the general air, sort of atmosphere and climate that this was being written in. All right. Now, let's begin the story. We all like a story, don't we? Let's tell a story. So, Act 1, Scene 1. We're only going to go through to Act 1, Scene 4 today because it's Act 1, Scene 4 is the last scene before we meet Lady Macbeth. And it kind of, I just thought that was quite a nice closing point. And also, if I did the whole thing today, we would literally be here forever. So we're going to do Act 1, Scene 1, 2, 3, and 4. So let's start with Act 1, Scene 1. Now, as I mentioned, we begin this play with three witches. Now, we're on a heath. Some versions of the play will actually say something like a deserted place or, a desert land or whatever. The key is to just understand that it is a deserted, bleak, desolate place that we begin this play in. We also see some of Shakespeare's lovely pathetic fallacy, which is, hopefully we all know, when the mood reflects the weather. And we see that with thunder and lightning straight away. All right. Now, as much as that's not the most high-tech, sophisticated thing to point out if we were writing an essay, it is worth bearing in mind that stage directions are not something that Shakespeare uses a huge amount of. Okay, it's one of the reasons Shakespeare's plays are so widely appreciated and used and shown. They can sort of transcend language barriers. They can transcend all sorts of different age gaps and everything, because ultimately he doesn't dictate really strictly how he wants things performed, how he wants lines read. All right, I'm sure a lot of you will have looked at an Inspector Calls as another part of your exam. In an Inspector Calls, you will remember probably that Priestley loves the stage direction, doesn't he? He absolutely loves it, and he will exactly say how he wants certain people to say certain lines. He will make sure that he tells them exactly when to walk across the stage, when to pick up the telephone, how to pour a drink. Shakespeare's very different from that, okay? Because what Shakespeare does is sort of leave it very open to interpretation. So bear this in mind when you think about the fact that he specifically wants there to be thunder and lightning in the opening of the play, okay? He wants there to be thunder and lightning, and he wants it to be a little bit creepy, a little bit spooky, all right? And it's very effective, okay? Again, we have to remember that we are not the audience this was originally intended for. And we also have to remember the sort of all of that stagecraft that would have had to go into that at the time. They wouldn't have just been able to sort of put on a sound effects tape. That would have all been sort of handmade sound effects. So very interesting, very clever. Well done, Shakespeare. Of course, he is the Don. He knows what he's doing. So we meet these three witches, okay? And the first thing that the three witches sort of start doing is they start talking about when they're going to get together again. And you'll probably remember, when shall we three meet again, in thunder, lightning, or in rain? And essentially what they decide, or what they talk about, is that they're going to meet again when the hurly-burly's done, when the battle is lost and won. Now, there's a couple of things to think about with this, okay? So these three witches, they got together. They've clearly, I don't know, they must have been doing something before we saw them, because otherwise they're just talking about meeting again, having just met, which seems odd. So we're going to assume they've been together. But the point that I want to sort of comment on here is, number one, when the hurly-burly is done just means kind of when the chaos is over, because we discovered very quickly afterwards that there's a battle going on, okay? But what's interesting is when they talk about this battle being lost and won, I always use the analogy of a football match. If you were a football supporter, I'm not massively, but if you are one, you would go to a football match and you would watch your team and you would support your team, and your team would either win or lose. When you go home and sort of say to anyone at home who asks, "Oh, how was the match?" you wouldn't go, "Oh, it was lost and won." You'd say, "Oh, we lost," or "Oh, we won." So I always think it's really significant that the witches say when the battle's lost and won, because it starts to remind the audience that they don't have a place in this world. They hover above it. They sort of are part of it in a very, very detached way. They are there to create chaos. They are there to sort of mess things up, but they don't pick sides particularly. You know, they're not rooting for anyone. They're just there. And they're just there to sort of be witchy and horrible and create problems, as we see later on. So I really like that sort of quite balanced way of saying it, you know, when the battle is lost and won. I think that's quite clever. So they decide that they're going to meet again when the battle's over. Again, we don't quite know what that battle is yet, but we find out very quickly in the next scene that it is a battle between Scotland and Norway. If I didn't mention before, this play is obviously set in Scotland in the 11th century. So also remember that even though it was written in the 1600s, it was actually set in the 1000s. Okay, so a long time before that. Bear that in mind, because it does sort of add to our understanding of, again, what the thanes are and why they're all in castles, etc., etc. So the witches agree that they're going to meet when the battle's lost and won. Also, at that point, one of the witches says, well, that will be the set of sun, as in the battle will be over before the sun sets. Now, the other thing to think about is, well, that suggests the witches have supernatural knowledge. They have knowledge that they shouldn't have. They have no way of understanding or knowing when the battle's going to be over, but yet they do. So there's all these little moments where, yes, you can say they speak in oxymorons, it's equivocation, but also delve into actually what is Shakespeare subtly suggesting about them by, you know, having those little things be said. Why is he saying, you know, lost and won? Why do they know when the battle's going to be over? So on and so forth, okay? And they also say they're going to meet on the heath to meet Macbeth. And obviously, this is the first mention of our titular character, Macbeth. We don't know who Macbeth is at this point. We just know that three witches are planning to meet him. So at this moment in time, we haven't potentially got a massively good impression of Macbeth, have we? We're not necessarily thinking, oh, he sounds like a stand-up guy, because he sounds potentially like he's mixing with witches. We don't know if he's ever seen them before. We just don't know yet. So anyway, we know that the witches are planning on seeing Macbeth. So you would sort of assume that, okay, well, the next scene we'll see this happen. But no, what Shakespeare does is he takes us to a really different environment now. What he does is he takes us to see King Duncan, and he takes us to see the actual battle that's going on, or sort of part of the battle that's going on. So we are taken now to somewhere near the battle that's going on, and we meet King Duncan and we meet his son, Malcolm. We're on to Act 1, Scene 2 now, in case you weren't clear. And Duncan is asking for updates about what's been going on in the battle, okay? And they bring to him, sometimes it's a wounded soldier, some versions of the play say, and some say a wounded captain. Either way, it's someone who's been in the battle and they're fighting and now they're wounded and they've been brought to him to give them news. So this captain gives Duncan news of Macbeth, and his right-hand man, his best friend Banquo. And we discover at this point that Macbeth is the man, right? When things were looking really bad, they doubled their attacks, they redoubled their attacks. They were like cannons overcharged with double cracks. They were absolutely having it, right? And they were not letting Norway win. And they just kept going and they kept fighting, and they are bloody and they are bloodthirsty and they are violent and they're bathing in reeking wounds and all of this stuff. So we learn very quickly that Macbeth's a war hero, right? Duncan's listening to this, going, oh, valiant cousin, worthy gentleman. He thinks he's brilliant. And we sort of are getting a really glowing impression of what Macbeth is like. Now, that's all lovely. That's great. The interesting thing about that, of course, is that the audience are potentially left in a slightly confusing position, because a minute ago we thought that Macbeth might be potentially a bit shady because the witches were talking about meeting him. But now we can hear a king singing his praises, and he's a hero and he's loyal. So before we even meet Macbeth, Shakespeare has very cleverly introduced us to almost two different characters. And therefore, we don't know what to expect when we actually finally meet him. And we're not made to wait too long because we meet him in the next scene. But before I go on to the next scene, something else to think about is the fact that in this scene, we also learn that there has been a bit of a naughty boy in Scotland doing some naughty stuff. He's been betraying Duncan, he's been betraying Scotland. And this is a man known as the Thane of Cawdor. Now, at the time, and I really should have looked this up before I started doing this, at the time in Scotland, there were thanes, okay? I don't know if they still exist anymore, but what they essentially were like, you know, like counts or dukes, or it's a noble title, okay? I don't believe we have them in this country, but yeah, that's what they are. So at the beginning of this play, you don't know this yet. You're about to find out. That Macbeth is the thane of a place called Glamis. Now, Glamis, it looks like Glamis if it's written down. So you've probably seen it and thought it's Glamis. I thought it was Glamis for about 10 years, so it's really not a problem. Also, you only ever write it down. You don't have to say it to anyone in an exam. So, however, it helps you remember it really. Like hyperbole looks like hyperbole. Fine, you only have to write it down, don't you? So, Macbeth at the beginning of this play is Thane of Glamis, okay? And there's another person we meet a little bit later on called Macduff. He is the Thane of Fife. So there is another character who we never actually meet. He's the Thane of Cawdor. We discover in Act 1, Scene 2 that he's been a naughty boy. He's been sort of betraying the king and the country by, I think, sort of giving secrets away to the opposing team, you know, like the opposing country. So Norway, he's been sort of like giving away secrets and stuff. So obviously Duncan is like, well, we've got to put a stop to this. We've got to have him executed, obviously. And he says, strip him of his former title, so strip him of his name, so he's no longer going to be Thane of Cawdor. He doesn't get that anymore. He doesn't get that privilege. But with that former title, greet Macbeth. Okay. So what he's saying here is go to Macbeth and give him the Thane of Cawdor's title. Macbeth's been brilliant. He deserves it. Well done, Macbeth. You deserve that. You've been a really, really good boy. And now you deserve to be made Thane of Cawdor as well as Thane of Glamis. And I think it finishes by saying what he hath lost, noble Macbeth hath won. So Macbeth is sort of, you know, even though he doesn't know yet that he's going to be made Thane of Cawdor, he is really, really sort of being bigged up by everybody there. That's very exciting. Now, we still haven't met Macbeth. Now, this is where Shakespeare does something rather clever. Because what he does is he uses that lovely technique that I'm sure you all know of called dramatic irony. Because at this point in the play, we now know that he's about to be made Thane of Cawdor, but he doesn't, all right, because he's not there. Him and Banquo, I don't know what they're actually doing when we meet them. They're just sort of wandering across a moor somewhere. I think they're on their way back to Duncan from the battle. So I don't know where Duncan was. They're all in the war somewhere. But they're walking across in Act 1, Scene 3, and that's where the witches find them. So they're not aware of the plans that have been made for him to be made Thane of Cawdor. And the audience are aware. Dramatic irony. Aren't you clever, Shakespeare? So at this point, we move on pretty much to Act 1, Scene 3. And this is where we finally meet Macbeth. We meet Macbeth and we meet Banquo. And they are walking across a moor or a heath, or it sometimes differs depending on the version of the play you're reading, but the point is they're walking across somewhere. And something that I always think is a really nice touch is Shakespeare has Macbeth's first lines in the play be, "So foul and fair a day I have not seen." Now, this is interesting because if you were to read Act 1, Scene 1 in detail, obviously we're just talking about it as a story, one of the last things the witches say is, "Fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air." And if you think about the similarity there between what Macbeth says in his first lines and what the witches say sort of in the closing of that scene, there's a real, obviously, similarity. There's literally the same words in that. They don't say it exactly in the same way, but it's pretty similar. Now, what I think is fascinating here is it suggests a couple of things, okay? It suggests a couple of things. First thing it suggests is that Macbeth, potentially similarly to the witches, doesn't necessarily see the world the way other people do. If you think about what that means, fair is foul as foul is fair. Yes, it's oxymoronic. Yes, it potentially is a bit of nonsense. But the other thing it suggests is that things that some people would see as bad, they see as good, and vice versa. It could suggest that Macbeth has a similar outlook on the world. The other thing it might do is suggest that Macbeth is maybe subconsciously linked to the witches before he even meets them. Maybe it's Shakespeare hinting that he's going to have a susceptibility to them. There's something of that kind of evil within him before the play even begins. Because I don't think any of us could say he was a completely good guy before the witches came along. Okay, I think I would argue that he probably wouldn't have necessarily done what he did, not what he'd done, had Lady Macbeth not gotten involved, etc. But it does suggest that there's something in him that ultimately is intrinsically bad, right? So anyway, he starts off by saying that. And, give him his dues. He's just been in a battle. There's been a lot of death. There's been a lot of violence. They did win, but people died. So, it probably was a fair and foul day. So they are wandering across, talking about the battle, wondering how far it is that they've got to keep walking. And suddenly these three witches appear. Okay. Now, at this point, we do see Shakespeare making sure that we are made aware that Macbeth and Banquo, despite the fact that they are close, despite the fact that they have fought together, etc., they're very different characters, all right? Because whereas Macbeth is quite quickly entranced by the witches and kind of amazed by them and finds it difficult to, he doesn't want them to go. When he starts hearing what they say to him, he sort of tells them to stay and tell him more. Banquo is a little bit more dismissive of them and quite rude, actually. He sort of talks about them having beards and he sort of tells them a little bit more what to do, whereas Macbeth at times seems a little bit in awe of them. So we don't see that by what the stage directions tell Macbeth to do. Again, Shakespeare actually does it through having Banquo say things such as, well, why are you looking so, startled by what they say? So his lines suggest that Macbeth is acting in a certain way. It's not that Macbeth is necessarily being told to do that. Again, it's just Shakespeare being clever. So I'm assuming we all know, but ultimately, the three things the witches tell Macbeth, the first thing they say is, "Hail, Thane of Glamis." All right, cool, fine, whatever. The next witch says, "Hail to thee, Macbeth, Thane of Cawdor." Okay, well, the audience know that already. The audience are now going to be like, oh, hang on, but Macbeth doesn't know that. Okay, so we're not necessarily going to think that Macbeth's going to jump on that and go, well, that's amazing, you're so clever. Anyone could know he's Thane of Glamis, and at the moment, he don't know he's Thane of Cawdor. So, okay, you crazy ladies. And the final thing they say is, "Hail to thee, who shalt Macbeth, who shalt be king hereafter." Now, if someone told you one thing that was true and two things that weren't, you'd probably go, all right, then cool, like, you ain't that clever. You've told me one thing, great, but two things that are completely not true. Macbeth does sort of question them, all right? But again, we have to remember that, yes, it shows that he wants to be king deep down and he's got that drive and, all of that stuff. But we also have to remember that he's a human being, okay? And what Shakespeare's so good at doing, all right, and this is why I love him, is he creates humans, he creates people that we can get, because people don't act like superheroes in his plays. People talk about stuff and people go back on themselves and people question themselves. So, he doesn't, fast forward a little bit, when Lady Macbeth gets involved and says, well, you've got to kill Duncan, he doesn't go, all right, cool, and just do it. He goes backwards and forwards. He thinks about it. He has a couple of soliloquies. He wonders. He tells her no. He gets scared and doesn't tell her no again. So we have to remember that Shakespeare creates humans. And he does this here because if you think about it, if someone told you something brilliant that was going to happen to you in the future, you're going to be a millionaire, you're going to win £1,000,000. Are you going to go, all right, cool, bye? Or are you going to go, okay, could you tell me more about that then? When's that going to happen? How's that going to happen? Is it going to be soon? Like, what's going to come about? What do I need to do to make that happen? And ultimately, that's sort of what Macbeth does at first, because the witches, after they tell him that stuff, they have a little chat with Banquo, which I'll talk to you about in a second. but before they sort of they start to want to go, and you know, Macbeth's like, "Stay, you imperfect speakers. Tell me more. What do you mean about this? The Thane of Cawdor's alive. He lives. He's a prosperous gentleman. Why are you dressing me in borrowed robes?" And I think it's really sort of important to remember, because it's very easy in an exam to go, "Well, this shows us that he's evil because he wants to be king straight away because he's listening to the witches." I think any of us would listen to someone telling us, "Well, I know that you're going to have something great soon," because, like I said, we're humans and we're flawed and we're susceptible to be tempted and we're susceptible to be manipulated. Doesn't mean we would all go and murder a king, but I think we can, you know, understand that someone would be intrigued by being told something great. Okay? So, anyway, the witches tell him those three things. They also tell Banquo a couple of things. They tell him that he's not going to be a king, but he will be a father to kings. And they tell him sort of, again, some more oxymoronic, equivocal things like, "You will be, you're lesser than Macbeth but greater, and you're not so happy but yet much happier." Lots of these sort of, again, witchy, oxymoronic, confusing things. And what I like is, again, you see that Banquo is clearly Macbeth's foil character, foil, foil character. Banquo highlights sort of the flaws in Macbeth, the differences in Macbeth. He, as a character, as a construct, is very different to the way Macbeth is. Whereas Macbeth is kind of drawn in by the witches, Banquo's a little bit more like, "All right, you think you're so good, you've told him some stuff, tell me stuff then. You think you're so clever, you think you can see into the seed, you know, you can look at the seeds of time and decide which ones will grow. All right, then you tell me." And that's when they sort of tell him a couple of things. So after they've done that, they disappear. Okay. And Macbeth and Banquo are sort of left there going, "Oh, okay." And Banquo sort of questions Macbeth on why he seems so startled by things that sound good. Uh, but then it's sort of nothing really, they don't really talk anymore because two messengers turn up. All right. And these are the messengers sent by Duncan, if you remember, in Act 1, Scene 2, wanting to tell him the good news that he has been made Thane of Cawdor. All right. So at this point, when they tell him that, 1 out of 3 becomes 2 out of 3 that the witch has told him being true. Okay. And so I think Banquo actually says, like, "Does the devil speak true?" And obviously, this changes things. This changes things for everybody. And the audience now know that the witches were right about two things. Well, we kind of already did. But now Banquo and Macbeth know too that the witches were right. Now, obviously, if two of those things were right, what are you going to start thinking about that third one? Yeah. But that's a bit of a scary one, isn't it? Because as we talked about at the beginning, this was not a time where thinking, even thinking about, you know, taking a king's place on the throne, that's blasphemy. That's a sinful deed, because ultimately that means you're saying that you don't agree that God made the right election in having that king there. You know, it's not your place to try and move up or down that chain of being. No, 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 stay away. So therefore, Macbeth has to be a little bit sneaky at this point, and this is where we start seeing that sort of sneaky side of Macbeth, because what he does is he starts having what we call asides, and these asides are moments where he looks, or not necessarily looks, but he sort of talks to himself aloud to allow an audience to know what he's thinking, but it's not for the other characters in the play to know what he's thinking. All right. And so what he does is he starts thinking about, well, 2 out of 3, the greatest is behind. Obviously, the greatest being the king, but he says it to himself. It shows that he's already starting to not say everything he's thinking. He's already getting to a point where he's like, "No, I'm I'm not happy to completely open up about how I feel about all this in front of everyone, because I know that's dodgy territory, it's risky ground." So he decides to sort of keep it to himself. So we learn at this point that he's going to be playing a Cawdor now, and pretty much at that point we'll move on to the final scene that we're going to talk about today, Act 1, Scene 4. Now, this is a lovely little scene, because in this scene we see Macbeth, Banquo, and Duncan reunited. Okay, and it tells us a lot. It tells us a lot, this scene. Firstly, what Shakespeare does is show us a king who is just lovely, right? He's just a really lovely bloke. You could argue a little bit too trusting, a little bit too naive, but he is humble and he is grateful to his subject. And King James actually spoke about the importance of the relationship between, like in real life, King James did at the time, about the importance of the relationship between a king and his subjects, and sort of how important it is for him to, like, it's a mutual contract. So it's not just that they owe him, you know, loyalty. Actually, he owes them. He should almost be like a father to them. And you really see that shine through in Duncan, because what Duncan does is he gives Banquo a cuddle, and he's sort of like, oh God, I can't be any more grateful to you. You're just the best. I'm so sorry, I'm not more grateful. And Macbeth's like, no, 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 it's fine, because I love doing it for you, because it's just an absolute joy to serve you. And they have a proper little bromance going on, right? And they're loving each other. And so they sort of have this. And the other thing that I think is really nice about this scene is, and I only noticed it maybe this year of teaching this play, but I don't know how much you know about like the royal we, but when there's sort of a king, they'll often speak in the sort of this sort of inclusive, like, we feel, us, we. So they don't use the sort of pronoun I. So they talk about themselves as a sort of a collective. I think it's almost like us as in the country, you know, because they represent the country. And what's really interesting is at this point in the play, Duncan actually doesn't. He actually, it's almost like he lowers himself down to Macbeth and Banquo's level, and he says I. He says my gratitude. And I always think that's a really nice touch of Shakespeare's, because it's like it's just that little moment where it's just, he's so clever, isn't he? Because it's just Duncan, therefore, being humble and being a man of the people, and not being this kind of lofty, I'm better than everybody role, which is when once we start seeing Macbeth on the throne, it doesn't quite work like that, does it? So that's a nice touch, I think. The other nice touch that Shakespeare brings in here is before the men come in, Duncan is asking about what happened to the Thane of Cawdor. You know, did he get executed? What happened when it was done? He just wants an update. And what he's told is that, you know, the Thane of Cawdor, he was really guilty for what he did. He actually was very sorry for what he did by the end of things. And I think it's, you know, nothing became his life like the losing of it. So, you know, he only really showed himself to be the sort of real man he could have been at the point that he was losing his life. He realised what he'd thrown away. Now, at this point, Duncan says a very astute and perceptive thing. He says there's no art to find the mind's construction in the face. Okay? There's no way, ultimately, is there, of us knowing if someone's lying to us. If someone wants to lie to us and they're good at it, we don't know what they're thinking by looking at their face. We've got no idea. And he comments on that, and he comments on the fact that it's hard to trust people. And then he says he was a gentleman on whom I built an absolute trust. Now, yes, he did, and he feels potentially like, oh, I shouldn't have trusted him. I should have realised that he wasn't to be trusted. The bit that I find brilliant is at that moment, Shakespeare has Macbeth walk in. Just as he's talking about how you can't always trust people, you don't always know what they're thinking, in strolls Macbeth. All right. And on top of that, as soon as Duncan sees him, he's like, oh, Macbeth, valiant cousin, worthy gentleman, come here, come here. I'm so grateful to you. I trust you completely, you know. And you can just see that Duncan sort of is repeating the mistake that he made before. And I always think that Malcolm later on in the play shows himself to have all the good traits of his dad, but also has learned a little bit from his dad's mistakes, and so um, is more sort of hesitant and reticent to trust people. You only have to think of Act 4, sorry, scene 1, 2, or 3, I can't remember, when he is in England with Macduff and he's sort of testing him, and he's a bit deceptive, but it's because he needs to make sure he can trust Macduff. So you see that Malcolm learns from Duncan being so trusting. But I just love that timing of him walking in just as he's talking about not trusting people and how he immediately trusts someone else. So they meet. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You're the best. No, you're the best. Oh, we love you. We love you. We discover that they are going to be dining and celebrating at Macbeth's castle that night. So we know that Duncan's going to be going there. And the other thing we discover in this scene, just before we finish, is we discover that Malcolm, who I talked to you a little bit about earlier, Malcolm is named in this scene as the heir to the throne. So Duncan actually names him to be his heir. Okay. Now that's lovely, and it's kind of expected, of course, because he's the eldest son, and that's lovely, and he's the king, and blah blah blah. But what's interesting is obviously Macbeth now having these thoughts in his head about what the witches said to him. He loves Duncan. You can see that he's loyal to him. He really looks up to him. It's not like he's suddenly gone, well, Duncan's dead, because it's a scary thought to him. He doesn't like it. He says a bit earlier on, these thoughts cannot be good, but they can't be bad either. Because if they were bad, they wouldn't have brought me things like success of being Thane of Cawdor. But if they're good, why are they making me even think about killing the king? Okay. However, when it's mentioned that the Prince of Cumberland, Malcolm, is going to be the next king, Macbeth has another one of his little asides, which shows he's being sneaky, remember, where he says, the Prince of Cumberland, that is a step on which I must fall down or else overleap, for in my way it lies. So he's not completely squeaky clean then, is he? Because he is thinking about the kingship as something he wants to attain, and he is now seeing Malcolm as an obstacle to that. So you can see this duplicity in Macbeth early on. Not this evil necessarily, but this maybe susceptibility to be evil, this susceptibility to make the wrong choices, to be manipulated. So by the end of Act 1, Scene 4, I feel like we've had a really nice introduction to some of our key characters. And I finished my makeup around the right sort of time. And this has been going on long enough, and you're probably very bored. If you felt that that was in any way helpful for you to understand the story a little bit better, okay, exam technique can wait, and that can be something I do separately or whatever. But if you do feel like this was in some way helpful to you, and you would like a next part of the next, the next part of the play or whatever, maybe just give me a like or something like that, so I know to waste my time doing it again. And yeah, thank you for watching, and I hope this has helped you. Bye bye.